I have the great hope now because I have an experience of unconditional love I can always go back to. That was the most real thing I've ever experienced in my life.
And today's episode is no exception, and I'm very excited to welcome Dr. McGovern. Dr. McGovern is a surgeon, he's a father, and he's a disciple of Jesus Christ. So Dr. McGovern, welcome to G2G.
Dr. Thomas McGovern is a renowned dermatologist, surgeon, author, and faithful Catholic who has journeyed from success to surrender, finding true identity in God. Dr. McGovern is highly respected in his field, specializing in Mohs surgery and facial reconstruction in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He has served in leadership roles with the Catholic Medical Association, including founding the Dr. Jerome Lejeune Guild of Northeast Indiana and representing Region 4. For many years, Dr. McGovern also served as a co-host on the Dr. podcast, where he shared faith-centered insights into medicine. Despite tremendous success and the accolades, he reached a crossroads in life. In his words, "I resigned from my CMA activities and from doctor to seek healing from burnout, anxiety, and suffering." Dr. McGovern opens up about his journey, sharing how God has transformed his life through surrender and healing. After years of seeking identity through achievements, he now embraces his true worth as a beloved Son of God. Working with the John Paul II Healing Center, Dr. McGovern experienced a deep spiritual renewal, one that has reshaped his life and priorities. His story is one of humility, self-discovery, and the profound peace that comes from letting go and letting God. Today, he's here to share this powerful testimony, a story that may resonate with anyone struggling to find their identity in worldly success. Dr. McGovern's journey shows that when we surrender to God, true healing and transformation are made possible. We are honored to welcome Dr. Thomas McGovern to Glory to God as he shares how he has found peace, purpose, and a new path by embracing his true identity in Christ.
So Dr. McGovern, welcome to G2G.
Thank you, Pete. Good to be here.
What initially drew you to the medical world? You've been a doctor for many years. What was the thing that kind of inspired you at the beginning to pursue this profession?
When I was a little boy, I used to take my red wagon 6 blocks to the Carnegie Library, where in the basement, at the bottom of the steps on the left, there was a whole section entitled, "When I Grow Up, I Want to Be a Blank." And I read like 30 or 40 of those books. And I think from that and other experience, I thought, wow, the thing that engages my imagination and my skills and challenges me the most would be to be a doctor. So it was a very intellectual thing. I loved studying biology. I loved math and science. It's like, this is the challenging thing I can do. And from the age of 10, I thought, this is what I'm going to be. And I never questioned it again because I got a lot of reinforcement from others about it because no one in my family had ever been in medicine. I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do.
As I was reading about your life and your bio, I mean, it's full of achievements, it's full of accomplishments, it's full of different moments of being recognized for doing great things and accomplishing real things. And it's worth acknowledging that you and the Lord have done a lot in your life. I was listening to a talk where you talked about how for a long time your identity was formed on whether or not you achieved something and whether or not somebody acknowledged that achievement. So could you unpack what you mean by your identity being founded on achievement?
The Institute for Priestly Formation talks about the importance of an acronym, RIM, R-I-M. Relationships give us our identity. It's typically relationships when we're young and relationships with God, so our parents and God. And then from that, we develop our identity, and from our identity flows our mission. I'd been living life upside down for over 50 years. I didn't have that identity from my early formation. Therefore, all the things I did, all my mission kind of cobbled together an identity. I'm the guy who knows this. I'm the guy who does that. And then from that, I hoped that I would have relationships where people would maybe love me, care for me, respect me. And you know how that worked? It didn't. because I kept trying to do more and more, and it did not fill the unfillable hole that I wanted for unconditional love.
And so, and yet you were journeying through life, going from different places, both in the military and for your practice. You get married along the way, have many children. As you look back on that and you reflect on, okay, at your identity being tied to whether or not you perform, what kind of impact did that have on your practice and your relationships? And then when did you discover that something needed to change?
Because of it, I suffered from anxiety and was on medication for over 30 years for the anxiety, because I could never meet up to these expectations. I never experienced unconditional love. So in my practice, the practice was just something I had to do. I had to do to support my family. I never really got much joy from it. And at home, as I discovered, I defaulted to things I could do well, but I didn't have a model. I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't know how to be a husband. So I often would disappear and do things I was good at. So those suffered also. And it's been gradually, with the patience of a saint of my wife over the years, but over some amazing things that have happened the last 2 years, that God has led me to healing. It started probably 5 years ago with a prayer to Saint Dymphna, the patroness of those with mental and nervous disorders. And a number of things have happened. And I'll let you guide how to telescope the many things, because it's been an amazing journey once I let God control it instead of me trying to control my own healing.
Now, that's a perfect transition to the next question I wanted to ask you, because I heard in that same talk, you talk about the difference between grasping and kind of trying to achieve your identity as opposed to letting it be bestowed on you. And you used the analogy of it like a tree of grasping as instead of the tree of gift that the Lord wants for us. How should we understand the difference between kind of grasping for our identity or letting it be bestowed on us?
It would be based on an analogy from the two trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if we're living life the way we're supposed to, the tree of life, our roots are grounded in love. We have security. And then based on the security, we can grow in maturity, like the trunk of the tree, grow to be like Christ, and then bear the fruit of maturity, of purity, which are the virtues. But instead, the other tree in the garden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, has a root of insecurity, because we aren't rooted and grounded in love, and therefore we are immature. I was immature. I've been immature, and we bear fruit of impurity. So that would be a tree of ungodly self-reliance or grasping, like you said. And so often we want to control life as human beings. I want to control my life. That was the weak point in my spiritual life, is control, which would of course lead to, probably the biggest sin that I would confess would be around anger. What's the antidote to that? The antidote to that is really letting God take control. And I had an interesting experience earlier this year in 2023. I was in charge of the CMA's involvement at Seek 23. And while there, I met the priest from my old college, said hi, bye, see ya. The following week, I resigned from everything I was doing in the CMA, because God wanted to heal me of my burnout and my anxiety. I went on a little hermitage retreat for 3 days. A priest there said, "Tom, you should pray this prayer of abandonment of St. Charles de Foucauld." Fine, Father, I'll do it. I get home from the retreat. The next day in the mail, I get this card with that prayer from that priest at the Sikh conference that the other priest at the hermitage had just recommended. Then a month later, I get this book based on that same prayer from a friend of mine. And the following week, I get that prayer texted to me. God wanted me to abandon myself. He was now leading me. And 2 weeks after starting to pray that prayer, you talked about my achievements. In this den where I'm recording now, I used to have a number of my awards and stuff on the shelves, on the wall. They became absolutely repugnant to me. And I stripped my home of anything that had anything to do with achievement. And it was so freeing. So that was kind of the beginning of big things happening.
What that process of healing looked like. So he's getting your attention, saying, okay, trying to confront the lie that you're only lovable if you perform, or you're only great if somebody acknowledges, or all the various lies. So he's getting your attention. And so what does that look like practically? So you give the example of the rewards looking and feeling repugnant. That's very powerful. But what was emerging in you, and what were you doing about it as you began that healing process?
So a lot of the principles are in this book by Bob Schutz called Be Healed, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life he also talks about the anatomy of a wound. We all have wounds, or we've been harmed by sin, our own sin and other sin. And around those wounds, we develop beliefs, usually false beliefs about ourselves and others. So, because when I was young, I was told, you're not very bright, you don't have common sense, you're not going to amount to much, I developed the false belief, the lie about myself, others are only going to love me if I perform. And so then I developed a vow, an unconscious resolution that I'm going to be the smartest guy in the room, the most accomplished guy in the room, so no one can ever say I'm lazy or stupid, and maybe they will like me. So how did God get me to heal that wound at the center of this behavior and probably the source of most of my confession material for decades? I was seeing a priest for deliverance prayer every week, and he was praying the prayer of St. Leo the 13th over me and another deliverance prayer over me. And in March of 2023, one day while praying over me, I had the first ever mystical experience of my life. As he's praying over me, just praying the words, usually those sessions were dry as dust emotionally, I saw Mary stand up in my imagination, pointing her arm to the left side, saying to the demons to take off, and I broke down in deep, sobbing tears in his office. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. After that, I had coming up 2 weeks later, something that Dr. Bob Schutz had offered me was to participate in this Healing the Whole Person retreat. And he had recommended this healing prayer that I've been praying, the 6-step healing prayer based on Catholic principles. And I always hit a barrier, never experienced the presence of Jesus in it. But on the second day of this retreat, he was leading us through that prayer. And all of a sudden, I was brought back to a memory when I was 7-year-old. Somebody was telling me, you're not very bright, you're pretty dumb. And all of a sudden, Jesus just comes in my imagination in a form I'd never seen, imagined, heard of, and just grabbed me from behind as a 7-year-old boy, just loving me in that moment when I was so hurt. And I just broke down, deep sobbing tears for half an hour. It's like, so this is what it feels like to be loved. The first time in almost 60 years of life, I felt unconditionally loved. Half an hour, that experience was worth everything and more than I'd ever accomplished in my life. Because after that, it's like that wound, it was healed. I don't have to prove anything to anybody in terms of accomplishments. And not to be outdone, the next day during that retreat, Sister Miriam James Heidland is leading us through another meditation. I just had something bad happen that day, was told one of my best assistants wanted to leave because she had no fun working for me. So I took this to Jesus, and again, I had another experience with him involving his Sacred Heart. And to prove I was changed, the next week, when that assistant who said she didn't want to worked with me for 2 more days, she went back to my CEO and said, I want to still work for him. Something's different. And now she still does. And she wants me to write her letter of recommendation for her to go to med school. So it's just been incredible since then.
One of the things I find amazing about your story is that part of your professional life as a physician and as a surgeon, in particular with cancer patients in dermatology, was trying to heal wounds, create a healthier life for people. And now the Lord has done the same, only in a much deeper spiritual way. Have you been able to reflect on that kind of interesting relationship between the work that you've done for decades and then the work that the Lord has done in you?
Yes, in fact, that's something my spiritual director has me reflecting on now. And it's not easy because for whatever reason, even though I'm treating 15 cancer patients a day, usually cancer's on the face, I just don't get fulfilled by it. The only thing at work that fulfills me, which is really kind of funny, is my post-op patients when they come in afterwards, and I get a couple minutes to just sit down and look them in the eye and relate to them one-on-one. For some reason, that's been more fulfilling than it ever has been. And now I don't dread going to work anymore. I don't necessarily enjoy it, but I don't mind it anymore. Yeah, I'm trying to see my work more as an apostolate. That's what I'm working on now. I would love to have joy at work. I usually don't, but I'm doing some things to try to improve that. But I've accepted God has me there. Patients do appreciate what I do. I just don't get any emotional gain from it, which sounds kind of weird, but I think I might not be a doctor if it hadn't been for what I did early in life. But now I'm here. God's going to use it. It's another part of my healing journey. In fact, earlier this year, something happened. There was an injustice that I'd been enduring for decades in my practice. And God finally allowed me to speak out about it. I thought I was going to have to leave my practice, maybe even leave medicine. And in a remarkable way that would take too long to go into, he gave me back my practice, gave voice to that injustice, and the injustice has been corrected. So I can now perhaps finish out my career where I've been for 24 years. So it's still a journey, Pete.
In your experience of your own journey into your heart, and as you become more aware of the wounds in you, and I'm sure that has allowed you to become more aware of the wounds in others, what sorts of wounds have you seen in people, or what are some common lies that you've encountered as you dove into your own heart, but become aware of what might be going on in somebody else's heart?
Just like the 7 deadly sins, the JP2 Healing Center people talk about 7 deadly wounds, abandonment. So it's either not getting some form of love you should have had, so being ignored growing up, having parents have to leave, being child of divorce, or rejection, something happens negative to you, or it can be some kind of physical trauma, it can be sexual trauma, it can be emotional abuse, it can be physical abuse, it can be having been in some kind of an accident, it can be being bullied growing up, being told you're not good enough, not meeting up. There are so many different things, and we fill up all those wounds with bad habits. The problem is the bad habit I filled my wound with was success. And that's one of the only addictions people say, yeah, keep at it, keep going. Whereas if it's drugs or gambling or pornography, they'll say, whoa, whoa, stop. The other wounds, abandonment, rejection, fear, shame, confusion, hopelessness, powerlessness, all those things can work against us.
You just said something very interesting that I want to unpack a little bit more of success being an addiction that society would fuel and even celebrate. And so, having done a little research into your life now, and discovering again a high degree of success, but then very recently a high degree of, I don't want to say rejection of that success, but stepping away from things that may have once kind of fueled that pride or fueled that need to be great. So can you dive a little bit more into some of the decisions you've recently made and why you've made them in terms of that kind of more obvious external success?
So God gave me a word of the year for 2023, and the word of the year was rest. As my spiritual director and a friend who's a psychiatrist said, unless you rest, you're not going to heal. So resting would involve giving up things that took my time. So I gave up being on the national board of the CMA. I had reorganized the young members of the CMA, the students and the interns and residents and fellows, gave that up. I'd also been doing for 6 years a podcast and radio show that's won a number of awards called Dr. Doctor. I gave that up because God asked me to give it up. God asked me to be willing to give up my practice, and I got to that point, but he gave that one back. The other two, he gave me complete peace to give up and to just revel in knowing that he loves me, in spending time with my family, and in giving myself to my work, where I've stopped working 5 days a week. I now work 4 days a week. So in other words, I had to strip away these things that were false sources of identity to just find my identity as man, husband, father, and beloved son of God. So I am waiting for him to show me other things that he wants me to do. That is really, really hard. I know he's going to show me because I'm getting to the point where I've rested so much that I think I'm ready to do something, but I want it to be him. So I'm waiting. And if I don't have something, I just go about my daily life the way that I'm supposed to. Like my spiritual director said, I'm living my life now the way that most people do, not the way that hyper successful people do. A great line from a man who recognized, Catholic man who recognizes that people that are usually successful usually are trying to do it to fill a wound. And that's Arthur C. Brooks. And in his book, Strength to Strength, he said it's a kind of superpower to let other people know your weaknesses and not care that they know about them. And I have found that to be so true this year.
How do you balance in this kind of this new identity, or maybe an identity you've always had, but you've recently discovered? How do you balance, and you're starting to speak to this in terms of coming maybe out of a season of rest, but balancing the desire to do great things, to accomplish awesome things for God and for the world, and to utilize and maximize your gifts? How do you balance that with kind of the humility and faithfulness of just trusting the Lord's plan, even if it seems small and hidden and insignificant?
Well, my life has been so imbalanced for so long in that realm that this year I'm being very careful. I'm trusting a number of good counselors I have who are experienced in prayer ministry, spiritual director, the priest I see for deliverance prayer, and my wife. And unless it's clear that it's from the Lord, I am just saying, no, I am waiting. In other words, I used to give talks on the virtue of magnanimity, doing great things for God. But right now, it's like it's the Mother Teresa thing, which in the Saint Teresa of Lisieux thing, it's, be faithful, not successful. So I'm trying to be faithful in what I've been clearly given and just waiting for a clear sign, not trying to jump the gun, trying to test the spirit. So right now, if I'm going to err, I'm going to err on the side of not doing enough and say, Lord, you want me to do it? You make it really clear. So I think that's what he wants. It's part of this year of rest. A book that's been really helpful this year is called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. And that's all part of it, waiting for God, spending a day of rest each week, Sabbath for God. And just waiting because he's in control. It's his deal. He has to show me.
As you continue on in this process and maybe discover new wounds or have wounds that have begun to be healed more completely, what gives you hope as you continue on in this process? And maybe could you tie that to what should we as viewers be hopeful about in our lives and in our world? So clearly you're on this path of healing because the Lord is calling you and you have great hope for its completion. How are we to understand that?
I have the great hope now because I have an experience of unconditional love I can always go back to. That was the most real thing I've ever experienced in my life. So the fact that I know how much he loves me and that God only works in gentleness, that I can now see the voices or know the voices that are lies, that are not him, that might claim to be him. So I know he wants my healing. He wants your healing more than you or I ever could want it. And he will take us there if we let him. And he wants it to be complete in heaven. I mean, Pope Benedict XVI said that essentially Christianity is a religion of healing. That's what salvation is. Its healing is from the wounds of sin so we can be who God made us to be. And so, yes, sometimes in healing, it's a season that's a painful season. It can be desolation. July and August for me were almost all desolation. I felt no warm and fuzzies, but I saw the memory. I knew God loved me, not just up here, but in my heart. And so every time I'd go by a crucifix, I'd say, Jesus, I love you. I don't feel it right now, but I love you and I trust you. So knowing that he wants my healing more than I do, I just can wait for his time because he's brought me great things in his time when I didn't expect them. But whenever I've tried to do it, nothing happens.
Well, Dr. McGovern, I want to thank you for sharing so honestly and personally about what the Lord has done in your heart and in your life. Incredibly inspiring testimony of what God wants to do in us and what he can do in us when we say yes to him. So thank you for your witness. Thank you for your practice. Thank you for your love of the Lord. And thank you for being on G2G.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure, Pete. God bless you.
And that's my challenge to all of you today who are watching G2G. Give your heart to the Lord and say, Jesus, what do you want to heal? What needs to be restored? And see what he does. I'm Pete Burak. This is Shalom World's original program, G2G, and we hope you can join us next time.